Hey everyone, this is Will from SRT Amplification, and in this video, we've got a very special guest. I'm doing an interview with Tony, otherwise known as XrayTonyB, and many of you that subscribe and view my channel also subscribe and view his channel as well, so many of you know him. If you don't know him and you're not familiar with what he does, he's got an excellent YouTube channel where he basically shares with the world his hobby of vintage audio gear, vintage electronics equipment, test equipment, all things electrical and electronic and audio. So check out his channel if you haven't. Very good. This interview is excellent. Tony was gracious enough to spend about an hour and a half with me on a Zoom meeting interview, and he gave up an hour and a half of his time. So I appreciate that. And I'm not going to be able to, have this video cover everything that we talked about. So I'm going to, take out the parts that are kind of relevant to electronics, audio, his background and stuff like that. But we talked about sports. We talked about music. We talked about the YouTube community. Very good portion of it's about the YouTube community. So he may put some of that stuff up on his Patreon account as little outtakes or extra stuff, extra video stuff for his Patreon subscribers. But I think you're going to get a lot out of this. I just want to preface before we get into it that this was a Zoom meeting interview, so there is some glitches here and there in the audio and a little bit in the video, but the vast majority of it is really good. It turned out really great. So and we didn't script this at all. I mean, I had some questions made up and we did cover some of that, but basically we just talked. And so it's unscripted. I don't have an introduction or anything. We just go to talking. And again, it's going to be a little chopped up as far as the topics that we talk about. So it's kind of pieced together, but somewhere out there at some time there will be those extras, whether I post them up later or he posts them, like I said, on his Patreon or however it comes out. We'll have some extra stuff there. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. You hit the nail on the head earlier when you said about back in our day we only had libraries, right? If we were rich enough, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica at our house, but we didn't. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't that well off as a kid, but that's a double-edged sword as well, because nowadays sometimes you have too much information.
Absolutely.
Not all of it is correct information, and you have everybody putting their 2 cents worth in on things. And
I'm really glad you brought that up. That is a fantastic point, and I should have thought of that. That's a great point. One of the other things that happens is, and I see this a lot, is someone will put something out there that's incorrect. And it may not be, they're not doing it maliciously. It could just be that somebody told them, and they say this thing, and then it becomes a popular video, and you have thousands of people spreading this. And all of a sudden, you find out that that's not correct. So you do have to use caution when you just, I call it, and you've heard me use this in my videos, being a Google scholar,
right.
The University of Google. I mean, there's still a great value to formal education in college. And I would never discourage anyone either going into the military or going to a formal college to learn electronics, because at least when you go to those places, they're using some of the texts that they use are many years old and are proven and have been proofread. The professors that are teaching us, I mean, one of my professors when I was in college, he was an old man. I mean, he was almost 80 years old. He was retired from Westinghouse. He was one of the main designers of the great big power line transformers. He was a transformer design engineer.
He probably knew Tesla.
I mean, honestly, and the things that he taught, he'd read it out of the book. Of course, that's what a professor does, but then the book would just go off to the side.
Yeah.
And he would start talking about when he designed a transformer, how you do it. And, you know, that is worth its weight in gold. I mean, you're not going to get that
Yeah.
just by Google searching something.
Right.
Um, so while I think this is, the beginning of this interview, while I think it's awesome, all the resources we have at our fingertips, you also have to use caution because there's so much information that, like you said, sometimes it can be too much.
Yeah.
One of my greatest fears is misleading someone in this industry, when I do a video. And I've done that. And there's times that I probably could have taken down the video, but I've left it up there. And I've always done a follow-up video saying, hey, I was wrong here, and this is where I was wrong. And either because I figured it out on my own or because somebody in the comment section was kind enough to correct that,
Yeah.
and post a response. And I think that's very important. I think it's important to know that you can learn something wrong from the internet. And I think it's also important to know that people can be wrong, and it's okay to correct yourself when you're wrong, and don't let your pride get in the way, show a little humility. And that's how you become effective in this line of work. As soon as you think you know it all, that's when you get burned.
Yeah, and
And
I think that's your appeal, especially is that that genuineness, that transparency, if you
mhm,
will. It's that's really, I think, what draws people, because I think they're just really tired of seeing these snobbish types, pretentious types that are out there, and they I guess it makes everybody's human, so
mhm.
we kind of gravitate to that. We want to see somebody's that's just as human as us. They're not Superman, or. So yeah, I think that's great.
I'll tell you a
Keep up
quick
the good
story.
work on that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll tell you a quick story. One of the reasons I got into X-ray is I have a cousin who is 17 years older than me. I have two cousins. One of them 17 years older than me. One of them's about 26 years older than me. Both electrical geniuses, and I really am. I don't amount to a wart on them
Mm.
as far as experience and knowledge goes. But when I was staying at my uncle's house for a week for a visit, he came and picked me up one morning and said, "You want to go to work with me?" And he worked for Siemens Medical. They're out of Germany. I'm
Yeah.
sure some of you are familiar with Siemens. They're
Yeah.
a huge company. One of my favorite X-ray machines, by the way. Anyway, we went out on a service call together. I was in 11th grade. I was still in high school. So I was only maybe 15 years old or so, maybe 16, 17, something like that. And we went out to a hospital and we worked on a fluoroscopy machine. Now, fluoroscopy, what is that? That's an X-ray machine that can take moving pictures uh, of someone with X-ray. So, for instance, if you have an obstruction in your throat, you can swallow some special radio opaque material, and the X-ray can actually, you can take a video of the swallowing process to see where it's getting obstructed or what's happening with your muscles. Okay, so there's a lot of use for it. You can also inject radio opaque dye into your vascular system, and that's called an angiogram. And you can actually watch your circulatory system in action, and that's called a vascular lab. And we use fluoroscopy for that as well. Anyway, we worked on this machine, and when I first came in there, this back in the day when you used old video cameras with pickup tubes. And by the way, I one of the X-ray parts houses donated a camera to me, an old video camera that uses the old Vidicon pickup tube. I'm going to do a video on one of those one of these days because I think it'd be interesting. And the image was terrible, and it was very hard to see. And so we worked on this camera, and we ended up replacing a sweep board in the camera. And I was very overwhelmed by all the racks and racks of equipment. I mean, back then, an X-ray machine, the electronics rack took up an entire room. It was huge. And I watched as my cousin worked his magic, and he kind of dialed that thing in until you could see, clear down to just a couple of line pairs per millimeter, you know. And the doctor came in and he said, I don't trust this machine. It's been acting up. Uh, I need you guys to sit in on the case with me. Now, this is before the HIPAA laws and all those things came into play. This is way back in the 80s, or maybe, yeah, early 80s. And he said, well, okay, So we stood there and I watched them do that case on that patient. And when it was all done, the doctor came around to the booth and he said, there's no way I would have been able to complete this case this way. I would have not seen the obstruction the way that thing was working. Thank you very much. I mean, you did a great job. And that really hit home with me. And I looked up at my cousin and I said, I want to do this when I grow up. When I graduate, that's where I want to go. And little did I know, 5 years later or so, that I would be getting my first job doing that. I never dreamed I would be able to. I got out of college, and I got a job on the electronic instrument gang in a mill, a steel mill, working on some of the automation things there. And I was at a wedding with my cousin. It was one of our other cousins getting married, and I told him what I was doing, and he's like, I thought you wanted to do X-ray. I said, yeah, but that's a pipe dream. Nobody will ever hire me. He says, well, how come you never tried? I said, because nobody will do it. And he says, you don't know that. So I applied with a company in Cleveland, Ohio, and I was one of only two people that was ever hired under their trainee program, because it ended up costing so much to train new people out of college. Myself and a guy that was hired about 6 months before me, and they canceled the program after the two of us went through, because it's a lot of money. I don't think people realize your college degree is nothing but the entryway to this line of work.
Right. Yeah.
Classes that we take, a 1 or 2 week class can cost as much as $8,000.
Yep.
For one class that's only a couple weeks long, and there's a whole string of those you have to take. And so you can understand the amount of investment it takes for the industry to train somebody. And that's why there's so few of us. There's not very many people that do what we do out in the field. And it is a time vampire. It consumes your life, it consumes your time, and your little hobbies like working on audio equipment kind of go by the wayside for about 10 or 15 years until you get some experience, and get the training under your belt. And that's kind of what I went through. And my cousin went through it, and I don't regret a minute of it. I love what I do. But that's the reason I got into it. And I've worked on so many pieces of equipment over the years, vascular labs, cardiac cath labs, mammography equipment. Mammography is another field that's incredible the way that it's growing right now. The equipment that we sell today in my company, I don't know if I can show you this or not. Maybe I can, but it has gotten so good. I don't know if this will show up on the video, but here's an X-ray I took of a machine we just installed. I don't know if you can see it or not. I think there's too much glare, but it's a dollar bill. And you can actually see the ink on both sides of the dollar bill superimposed over one another.
Oh, wow.
Our new X-ray detectors are so sensitive.
Oh.
And when you use that technology today, you can see things and you can diagnose things that 20 years ago would have been impossible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the moral of that story is that, indirectly, you're having the same effect or the same impact on people's lives as all those doctors, nurses, and everything in the hospital. So your job is just as important. So
exactly. And that's where the humility comes from,
Yeah.
is that when you work on these things and you realize that if you make a mistake, and I'm not trying to play on emotions, I ain't into that stuff. But the truth of the matter is, you have to take what you do very seriously,
Yeah.
because what you do can affect the health of others. You know, had my cousin not properly serviced that machine, that doctor would not have seen the obstruction that he was looking for. And it's as simple as that. So you could have the greatest doctor and the greatest hospital, the greatest health system in the world, but if they're using equipment that's not set up and working and calibrated properly, it's all for naught.
And I,
So even though we certainly don't get paid like doctors do, nor do we get any recognition for um, what we do is very important. And I don't forget that. I never will forget that. So I guess when I act the way I do in my videos, a little bit of that is coming into it. Um, I never try to think that I know everything or that I'm not capable of making a mistake. And that's why you always look at things twice and think through it and have an open mind to solving the problem. And that's hopefully, if somebody learns something from my channel, I hope they learn that more than just Ohm's law or little things we're doing at the bench.
I think
Is
if I think if everybody looked at their job the way that you just described it, the world would be a better place because there's
yeah,
always second and third order effects to everything that we do, and we don't
yep,
know what kind of impact. We may never see the impact that we're making. I mean,
no,
luckily you did see the impact, and that's kind of what what sits you on that
it,
road. But most people never do. So if they just think
no,
about it, they may see the realization.
absolutely. And I think it's not just this line of work. I think it's anything that you do.
Oh
If
yeah,
you do it with the intent that you want to be the best you can at it, I don't care if you're sweeping the floor. Do the best job of it that you can. It will pay off. It'll pay off for you personally, but it will also pay off for others that you're helping through that service you're providing. It's a big thing, and I try to teach all my employees that.
yeah.
Um, and I'm proud to say they're great people that work for me. I'm very blessed to have them working for me as well, because they all share that kind of attitude. So and that's important these days, I think, especially in these days.
So one of the original questions I had, and this may be a little bit dated because I think things have kind of changed, but so recently Transformers have been a big deal. There's not that many people out there wanting Transformers right now.
Mhm.
There's not that many people out there actually making tubes for tube amplifiers either. Although I
Yeah.
did hear that there's a company here in the United States that has started making some tubes,
Yes.
small batches, and
Yes.
but as far as solid state components go, the silicone shortage that's been happening with chips and stuff, I believe Ford even put out a statement here a while back that they couldn't make any more cars because the chips they need for their computer they can't get them. Have you
Mm-hmm.
ran into that situation for repair parts and stuff? What's the deal with that? Have you experienced any of that?
In our line of work, we have not yet. And the reason being is that, first of all, there's the number, of pieces of equipment being manufactured out there is relatively small. You know, what what we sell is a very focused, limited market. And so there's only so many people that need an x-ray machine. I mean, it's funny. I watch these videos of these guys that find an old X-ray part of an X-ray machine in a dump somewhere or something. They get there on eBay. They buy an old tube or something, and they're fumbling around with it in their garage. But other than that, really the use for that. I mean, we don't have a use for it outside of a medical environment or an industrial environment where you know the luggage,
Security
X-ray
and stuff, yeah.
security, things
Right.
like that, and X-ray gauging, where like one of the X-ray machines I worked on when I worked in the mill, was a thickness gauge. It would measure the attenuation of the X-ray beam to very accurately determine the thickness of the metal that was coming off the rolling mill, those kinds of things. But other than that, not a whole lot of it. And the parts thing has gotten a lot different over the years. First of all, when I started in the industry, you had bins and bins and bins of components, integrated circuits, resistors, transistors, capacitors, you name it. Your car was filled with this stuff. And you were expected to take this stuff down to component level and repair it in the field. I mean, the equipment was made to be worked on in the field.
Yeah.
Today, everything's surface mount. Everything uses, the programmed logic arrays and so forth. And, some diagnostic pops up, and one of the three boards that comprises the whole machine, it tells you which one it is, and you spend a whole lot of money and you replace the whole board.
Yeah.
Is that efficient? Maybe. It's efficient in that you don't have to train people to the level that they used to be, because it's very hard to train. That's the biggest expense in this industry, is training.
Yeah.
So, if you can, even though it's $10,000 for a board, whereas back then it was $5 for an integrated circuit chip, 74 LSOO or something, the amount of time you save and the amount of training you save by doing it that way, at least in their minds, offsets the old way of doing it. And most manufacturers will make spare parts, but something a lot of people don't realize is federal law states they only have to support a product for 7 years after they go out of production. So new models come out every year or two. So you pretty much have 7 or 8 years, maybe 10 years maximum, that an OEM has to support their product until they can say, well, it's end of life, and go fish for the parts, And that's where a lot of these used parts companies come into play. There are a lot of companies that will either harvest parts from old machines and test them and then, package them, or even some of the bigger places will actually refurbish the parts. They have the equipment to do that. And, there's a huge market for that. There's total businesses just for that only. So a lot of the parts are getting recycled in our industry, where you don't see that, with the automotive industry, they're making millions of something. So they might be able to get 10,000 of those chips, but they can't get 2 million of those chips. And that's why you see the problems you're seeing today, because the production is the big quantity things. We don't have a lot of that in our industry. So we haven't felt the pain yet. I think, and like I said, I don't know that we will, to the degree that some of the bigger manufacturers are seeing it. And then some of the products that we build really are not coming out of the same factories that the other industries are getting their product from. Like the digital detectors that we sell, that I showed you the dollar bill trick there. Those are manufactured, at a very specific place in South Korea. Most of everybody's product, no matter where they are in the world, comes out of those same 3 or 4 factories. And they have a specific mine that they get the gadolinium or the cesium that they use for the scintillators. And we'll have to talk about that one day. But anyway, that stuff's all manufactured there. And again, is kind of separated from the rest of the industry, if that answers the question, I think.
Oh, absolutely. But there's also in your hobby as well, a lot of the equipment that you work on, 70s and 80s,
Yep.
integrated amplifiers, radios, cassette decks, all that stuff. But in the amplifiers especially, I know in that time, like Pioneer, I think, was the biggest one that would, instead of their finals being transistors, they were an actual integrated
Yes.
module. Yep. And those are really hard to find. I mean, they don't make those anymore. So, where do you go for something like that? If somebody's out there looking.
I did I did a video a while back. There are 2 or 3 really enterprising individuals out there. I can't remember their names offhand, um, that have come up with these little tiny modules. One of them uses surface mount technology. The other one is through hole. I actually did a video on it where I replaced those STK modules on a Pioneer SX780 with a couple of those modules. And I was shocked how well they actually worked. And apparently the one with the surface mount technology doesn't even have a bias adjustment. It's self-biasing. It's a really nice product. I've not tried them. I did have the person who makes them reach out to me about a year or so ago and asked, told me about it and asked if I would like to try one. And I really should have taken him up on it, but I didn't get back to him. And now the email is in the lost in the ocean of emails.
Right.
But there are alternatives, and I do know the one that I did the video on the SX780, that started out as kind of like an open source project in a way that you can go, I believe it's on either on Audio Karma or on DIYaudio.com. I can't remember which one, but there's a whole thread on that particular thing, and you can download the Gerber files and you can download the parts list, the bill of materials from either Mauser or DigiKey, and you can have these printed like a JLC or
Yeah.
Any of the other ones out there, and you can make your own modules.
Hmm.
And
they're just
so
supposed
that's one alternative.
they're just supposed to be drop-in replacements, right? I mean, you just solder them in the same hole.
They are, yes. As a matter of fact, they show you the board has 2 holes drilled that are bigger than the mounting screws for the original SDK chip. And the idea is there's 4 other smaller holes where you attach this little board to a backer plate. That's a little piece of aluminum bar stock.
Okay.
And the screws go right through those open holes on the board, and they go onto that aluminum bar stock and secure it down to the heat sink of the SX780 or whatever device you're using for it. So it's a drop-in replacement. And the nice thing is the transistors that they chose have a very good transition frequency, and they're rated at much higher wattage and so forth than the original SDK chips. So they probably could even be used on, some of the larger amps that use the STK 0100 versus the 0080 and so forth, and they would still work. And I think they even will work on some of the smaller ones too, some of the smaller amps that use the 0040s and 30s and so forth. You just have to be careful because there's 2 different types of STK modules. I don't know if people realize that, but some of them use the quasi-complementary outputs where your 2 push-pull outputs are both NPN, for instance, and then you have the actual true complementary where one side's PNP, one side's NPN, and that's what this module is designed around, that particular one. So you have to make sure that the module you're replacing is compatible electronically with this module. But that's one thing. The other thing about vintage electronics is, well, it uses vintage parts. So they're not being manufactured now. So really it's kind of harvesting things out of old equipment or finding a suitable replacement. And I get a lot of questions on that too. I've done some videos on it to kind of replace or substitute for the old components that are no longer available.
So, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure a lot of people got quite a bit of information just off of that right there, because I know, somebody's got their father's Pioneer or whatever, and they want to get it restored, and it's the finals or what's out in it probably. So that's a big help right there.
I think the far greater challenge are the ones that were made like in 1979, 1980. At that point in time, all the major manufacturers like Pioneer, Sansui, Marantz, and all these guys, they really started getting into battles over specs, who has the lowest distortion, you know, and it begs the question, can you hear the difference between 0.0001% distortion and 0.00001%? I can't, maybe there's people that can, but in order to do that, they started getting in some very exotic types of circuitry. So for instance, my main listening system upstairs, I have a Pioneer SA 9800, and it uses very special output transistors called ring emitter transistors. I've done several videos on these two. There's ring emitter, and I'm having a senior moment, but there's another type that's a parallel array type output transistor. And the purpose for them is to have extremely high transition frequency when compared to a standard output transistor, if that makes sense. And what that's going to do is that's going to reduce the slew rate of the transistor, which will increase, they started getting into these things like the trans intermodulation distortion, or TIM distortion, as they call it. And there's always been debates over whether that's a real thing or not, and all this, and whether you could hear it or not. But full circle with the story, it has these weird transistors that you can't get anymore. And those are much harder to deal with than those SDK modules. SDK modules are just, inside them is still a traditional circuit of transistors that you can buy off the shelf. Those ring emitter jobs, there are some still in production by Sanken, I think makes them, but they're in a different case style and so forth. So you have to adapt the heat sink and everything for it. So you run into those, you're going to have a little bit of a challenge, or you're going to put something in there that's going to change the performance of the amplifier.
And I think the purists like myself, I'm a vinyl guy, and yeah, I do have a lot of cassette tapes too, and I listen to cassettes quite a bit. Out in my shop, I have a cassette player. In here, I've got this this tube amp. Came out of a console, an old console, I think it's I wanted to say Voice of America, but it's not Voice of America. It's man. Anyway, it's BOM. Voice of Music is the
Voice
manufacturer.
Music,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. But
Nice.
I listen to records most of the time, and most of the, I guess what you would call an audiophile, are they want that single-ended tube amp design. That's their fidelity.
Yes.
That's the
Yes.
now highly inefficient, but the most fidelity. You're not going to get a lot of crossover and notch distortion and stuff like that you're going to get from
Correct.
push pull amps. But that's so everything's kind of come back full circle. They tried to make all of these modern amplifiers and everything so great, low distortion, all that stuff, and it comes right back to the old way of doing things. So
Yes.
to the normal
I'm
consumer.
looking for a comment, right?
To a normal consumer, I understand that those things are probably not, affordable today, obviously.
Right.
And in today's
Right.
disposable world, we tend to just go out and get something, new after after it goes, we don't have repair people anymore, so.
Mm-hmm. I was looking for a comment because I just answered a comment to a viewer that's talking just about what you were just saying, okay, about the single-ended sound and so forth. And I wish I could find it real quick, but I couldn't. But I responded to it. What he was saying was that, he really appreciates the new technologies that are out there to, in sound, digital audio and so forth. But he still has a place in his heart for the original vinyl and the cassette and all these things. And I responded by saying, there are songs that I first heard on an old Seaberg jukebox in a bar somewhere or back in the shop, because I told you about my two cousins. The older cousin since the late 1940s, worked on pinball machines, jukeboxes, and so forth, and just retired. He's in his 80s right now. And he's really the source for myself and my other cousin for electronics. He taught us everything. And we would go in the summertime when school would let out, we'd stay at his house, and he'd take us to the shop, and out on calls. I'm 8, 9 years old. I'm going into bars. Probably shouldn't have, but we'd go in there to fix the jukeboxes when they break down at night on call. We were on call. And the first time I'd heard some of these songs was on these old jukeboxes.
Yeah.
And that's the way I remember those songs sound.
Yeah.
And later on, years later, I would go on to hear that same song on, just fabulous, expensive, precision audio equipment. And although the sound was pristine and perfect, it wasn't the same song I listened to on that jukebox 30 or 40 years earlier. And so I ended the comment by saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and sound is in the ear of the listener. And I think that's, no matter what kind of argument somebody can make for this, that, or the other type of audio equipment, it comes down to this personally. What you hear and what you remember of a song, that's what's going to make it special to you.
I know you're not going to be working on X-ray equipment for the rest of your life. There's going to be a point where you say, okay, I'm gonna retire from the field. I'm gonna, focus on this, that, or the other.
Absolutely.
What is the this, that, or the other that you're going to focus on in the future?
Well, number one, I think you never get out of the X-ray field. I have some very close friends that mentored me in the industry over the years. Some of them are in their 70s and 80s now, but they still somewhat stay involved and in touch with us. We become very close friends because there's so few of us. So I'll always be in the industry in some way, shape, or form. And, when my company goes to the employees or to whoever takes it over from me, I will still be there in the background to help them. But beyond that, I'm doing this kind of for some selfish reasons too. I'm setting myself up to have something to do so I don't go crazy when I retire. It started out with this. When I was 9 years old, I did my very first electronics project, and I'm coming full circle. I came in like this, I'm going to go out with this kind of stuff, tinkering at the bench. The cousin that taught me that I went on the X-ray call with, when I was 9 years old, I was over visiting his dad, my uncle. I was my dad's brother-in-law. And my dad went out with my other cousin, and they came back with a brand new Lafayette, I think it was like a Telsat 50 CB radio with sideband, 23 channel. It's kind of dating thing a little bit. But they came back with this thing and bought it. Lafayette was a big deal in Cleveland. That's where he was from. They had a pretty big place there, and my cousin actually got his start, I believe, as a bench tech for them right out of college, and before he got into the X-ray industry. So there was a lot of Lafayette equipment floating around out there, and we got one of these CB radios, and we're sitting around the dining room table drinking coffee and talking, the adults, and I'm sitting there, and I just asked the casual, innocent question, well, what if I wanted to listen to this thing in my house? Do I have to bring a car battery? How do I use it?
Yeah.
And and my cousin said, well, you'd use a power supply. And I'm like, what's that? 9-year-old kid. And they had a whole bunch of old punch cards off the old computers. I don't know if some of you might know what a punch card is. It's before floppy disks and things existed and hard drives. And it had a whole bunch of them that we turned them around on the back and kind of used them as little note cards to scribble on, take notes. And he took one of those and he flipped it over, and he took a pencil and he drew something that looks a little bit like this. I don't know if you can see it there. Little schematic. There's only 3 components there, you know, a transformer, a bridge, and a capacitor. And he proceeded to explain to me what those 3 parts were and what they did. And I was mesmerized. I'm like, really? I can plug my 12-volt CB radio in the wall with this thing, you know, and run it in my house. And of course, you know, on the way home, in my dad's ear the whole way, you know. And I said, how do I do this? And he says, well, you can buy those parts at Radio Shack, you know.
Yeah.
Dad, Radio Shack. And I go to Radio Shack, you know. So the next day, after work, my father very generously took me to Radio Shack, and we purchased those 3 parts and a little aluminum chassis case.
Right.
And I took it home. And and while I was there, you know, you have to solder all this stuff together. And my uncle went in the basement. He got an old 25-watt, it was the mint green color soldering iron, and gave it to me, you know, 9-year-old kid. So I diligently put this thing together, and I plugged it in, and I hooked up the CB, and lo and behold, the CB turned on, and my life was changed. And I never looked back.
Yeah.
So I kept that little punch card for years and years and years with that on it. And then when I moved out of my parents' house at some time, it got lost. But
You were
I
just
always looked.
you were just very lucky that the diodes that you chose were, you know, able to carry the current and all that you needed, right?
Oh, I didn't know about any of that stuff, you know. And it's like, you know, a diode's a diode, and a capacitor's a capacitor. You know, they all.
Yeah.
What's the difference? You know,
Right.
and a resistor. If it's 100 ohm, it's 100 ohm. Who cares what the wattage is? You know, great big sand resistor, and you stick your little quarter watt.
Right.
It would go up in smoke.
Yep.
That's what we did. You know, as I got along a little further, I started getting in tubes. Tubes just. I mean, they enthralled me. I just, you know, they were like magic.
Yeah.
These little things, you know. And I wanted to build a power supply that could drive a tube amp. And I got an old big transformer out of a television, and some same diodes, you know, no regards to the voltage or anything. They're PRV. And I made up this power supply, and I had an old CAN capacitor out of the television. Yeah, I wired it in there, and plugged it in, and, you know, it worked. And I'm down in the basement, and I go to unplug it, and I went to strip a wire in there, you know, to hook it up to a terminal, and I got right across that 450-volt cap, and it knocked me flat on my back. I mean, I hit the ground, and I opened my eyes, and there's my dad scooping me up off the floor, you know.
Mm.
Old Italian guy, what the hell are you doing? You know, yelling at me, you know. And
Oh,
and I learned what 450 volts DC feels like
yeah.
at a very tender age, and I decided it's not something I want to experience anymore.
No.
But, luckily, I'm still here.
Well, Tony, I know that you've shared so much in this interview that many of your viewers have never heard before and are probably very interested in hearing. But is there something that you'd like to leave the audience with that you can? I know a lot of times you got this story or you got this advice that you want to give, and you never can seem to find exactly where to fit it into one of your videos or whatever.
Yep.
And maybe this is the perfect time to put it out there. And also, if you would, after you share this, could you please lead us out with your famous outro? I would love to hear that again.
I will.
So, all right.
I will do that.
Okay.
Well, the first thing is, I think there's 2 people I want to address, or two groups of people. That is the young people out there. You have no idea how good you've got it in this industry right now, with all the available information that you can learn online and things. We're not getting any younger. This is just going to keep getting more gray. And we need you. There, people aren't learning the electronics uh, art as they have been in the past. It's a very exciting and lucrative career, and I want to encourage anybody who's young, who's thinking about this, to consider getting into it. And don't be afraid. Do it. Go out and learn it, ask questions, make mistakes, own up to those mistakes and correct them and get better and take my place one day. That's what I want. And to the older folks who have retired and who've kind of seen it from my perspective now that they want to rekindle that old love for vintage electronics or audio, or you want to do something, do it. You're not getting any younger, set up a little bench, go on eBay and buy some used cheap equipment, test equipment, and start tinkering and have fun. That's what it's about. Those are the two things that I would recommend to all of you. And honestly, that's the driving force behind my channel, is I hope that it inspires those two groups of people and everyone in between. So with that, as always, I will wish you all peace, joy, happiness, and good health in your lives. And I'll leave it to you, Will.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate this interview, and maybe we can do this again in 6 months or something like that. We can have it a regular occurrence every 6 months, or maybe even a year.
That'd be cool. That'd be cool. I enjoyed it. I had fun. I had a lot more fun than I ever anticipated. So
Yeah.
thank you.